Chapter 52 or Book 3, Part 23, Counting Sheep, the thing in the center of the circle. A few days after Ushikawa's first visit, I asked Cinnamon to bring me a newspaper whenever he came to the residence. It was time for me to begin getting in touch with the reality of the outside world. Try as you might to avoid it, when it was time, they came for you. Cinnamon nodded, and every day after that he would arrive with 3 newspapers. I would look through the papers in the morning after breakfast. I had not bothered with the newspapers for such a long time that they now struck me as strange, cold and empty. The stimulating smell of the ink gave me a headache, and the intensely black little gangs of type seemed to stab my eyes. The layout and headlines type style and the tone of the writing seemed unreal to me. I often had to put the paper down, close my eyes and release a sigh. It couldn't have been like this in the old days. Reading a newspaper must have been a far more ordinary experience for me than this. What had changed so much about them? Or rather, what had changed so much about me? After I had been reading the papers for a while, I was able to achieve a clear understanding of one fact concerning Noboru Wataya, namely that he was constructing an even more solid position for himself in society. At the same time that he was conducting an ambitious program of political activity as one of the up-and-coming new members of the House of Representatives, he was constantly making public pronouncements as a magazine columnist and a regular commentator on TV. I would see his name everywhere. For some reason I could not fathom, people were actually listening to his opinions, and with ever-increasing enthusiasm. He was brand new on the political stage, but he was already being celebrated as one of the young politicians from whom great things could be expected. He was named the country's most popular politician in a poll conducted by a woman's magazine. He was hailed as an activist intellectual, a new type of intelligent politician that had not been seen before. When I had read as much as I could stand about the current events and Noboru Wataya's prominent place in them, I turned to my growing collection of books on Manchukuo. Cinnamon had been bringing me everything he could find on the subject. Even here, though, I could not escape the shadow of Noboru Wataya. That day it emerged from the pages of a book on logistical problems. Published in 1978, the library copy had been borrowed only once before, when the book was new, and returned almost immediately. Perhaps only acquaintances of Lieutenant Mamiya were interested in logistical problems in Manchukuo. As early as 1920, according to the author, Japan's imperial army was looking into the possibility of amassing a huge inventory of winter survival gear in anticipation of all-out war with the Soviets. Equipping the army to fight in bitter cold was viewed as an urgent matter because they lacked the experience of having fought a real battle any place with such extreme winter cold as Siberia. If a border dispute led suddenly to a declaration of war against the Soviet Union, which was by no means out of the question in those days, the army was simply unprepared to persevere in a winter campaign. For this reason, a research team was established within the General Staff Office to prepare to fight a hypothetical war with the Soviet Union, the logistics section being charged with investigating the procurement of special winter clothing. In order to grasp what real cold was like, they went to the far northern island of Sakhalin, long a point of dispute with Tsarist Russia and then the Soviet Union, and used an actual fighting unit to test insulated boots and coats and underwear. They ran thorough tests on equipment currently in use by the Soviet army, and on the kind of clothing that Napoleon's army had used in its Russian campaign, reaching the conclusion that it would be impossible for the Japanese army to survive a winter in Siberia with its present equipment. They estimated that some 2/3 of the foot soldiers on the front lines would be put out of commission by frostbite. The army's current survival gear had been manufactured with the somewhat gentler northern China winters in mind, and it was lacking in terms of absolute numbers as well. The research team calculated the number of ships necessary to manufacture sufficient effective winter clothing to outfit 10 divisions. The joke making the rounds of the team then being that they were too busy counting sheep to sleep. And they submitted this in their report, along with estimates of the scale of mechanical equipment that would be needed to process the wool. The number of sheep on the Japanese home islands was clearly insufficient for fighting an extended war in the northern territories against the Soviet army in the event of the economic sanctions or an actual blockade against Japan. and thus it was imperative that Japan secure both a stable supply of wool and of rabbit and pelts in the Manchuria-Mongolia region and the mechanical equipment for processing it, said the report. The men dispatched to make on-the-spot reservations in Manchukuo in 1932, immediately after the founding of the puppet regime there, was a young technocrat newly graduated from the military staff college with a major in logistics. His name was Yoshitaka Wataya. Yoshitaka Wataya. This could only have been Noboru's uncle. There just weren't that many Wataya in the world, and the name Yoshitaka was the clincher. His mission was to calculate the time that would be needed before such stable supplies of wool could be secured in Manchukuo. Yoshitaka Wataya seized upon this problem of cold winter clothing as a model case for modern logistics and carried out an exhaustive numerical analysis. When he was in Mokden, Yoshitaka Wataya sought an introduction to and spent the entire night drinking and talking with Lieutenant General Kanji Ishiwara. Kanji Ishiwara, another name I knew well. Noboru Wataya's uncle had been in touch with Kanji Ishiwara, the ringleader the year before of the staged Chinese attack on Japanese troops known as the Manchurian Incident, the event that had enabled Japan to turn Manchuria into Manchukuo, and that later would prove to have been the first act in 15 years of war. Ishiwara had toured the continent and become convinced not only that all-out war with the Soviet Union was inevitable, but that the key to winning that war lay in strengthening Japan's logistical position by rapidly industrializing the newly formed empire of Manchukuo and establishing a self-sufficient economy. He presented his case to Yoshitaka Wataya with eloquence and passion. He argued, too, the importance of bringing farmers from Japan to systemize Manchukuo's farming and cattle industries and to raise the level of their efficiency. Ishiwara was of the opinion that Japan should not turn Manchukuo into another undisguised Japanese colony, such as Korea or Taiwan, and should instead make Manchukuo a new model Asian nation. In his recognition that Manchukuo would ultimately serve as a logistical base for war against the Soviet Union and even against the United States and England, Ishiwara was, however, admirably realistic. He believed that Japan was now the only Asian nation with the capability of fighting the coming war against the West, or as he called it, the final war, and that the other countries had the duty to cooperate with Japan for their own liberation from the West. No other officer in the Imperial Army at the time had Ishiwara's combination of a profound interest in logistics and great erudition. Most of the Japanese officers dismissed logistics as an effeminate discipline, believing instead that the proper way for His Majesty's warriors was to fight with bold self-abandonment no matter how ill-equipped one might be. The true martial glory lay in conquering a mighty foe when outnumbered and poorly armed. Strike the enemy and advance, too swiftly for supplies to keep up. That was the path of honor. To Yoshitaka Wataya, the complete technocrat, this was utter nonsense. Starting a long-term war without logistical back was tantamount to suicide in his view. The Soviets had vastly expanded and modernized their military capability through Stalin's 5-year plan of intensive economic development. The 5 bloody years of the First World War had destroyed the old world's values, and mechanized war had revolutionized European thinking with regard to strategy and logistics. Having been stationed for 2 years in Berlin, Yoshitaka Wataya knew the truth of this with every bone in his body. But the mentality of the greater part of Japan's military men had not outgrown the intoxication of their victory in the Russo-Japanese War nearly 30 years before. Yoshitaka Wataya went home to Japan a devoted admirer of Ishiwara's arguments, his worldview, and the charismatic personality of the man himself, and their close relationship lasted many years. He often went to visit Ishiwara, even after the distinguished officer had been brought back from Manchuria to take command of the isolated fortress in Maizuru. Yoshitaka Wataya's precise and meticulous report on sheep farming and wool processing in Manchukuo was submitted to headquarters shortly after he returned to Japan, and it received high praise. With Japan's painful defeat in 1939 Battle of Nomonhan, however, and strengthening of US and British economic sanctions, the military began to shift its attention southward, and the activities of the research team waging hypothetical war against the Soviet Union were allowed to peter out. Of course, One factor behind the decision to finish off the Battle of Nomonhan quickly in early autumn and not allow it to develop into a full-scale war was the research team's conclusive report that we are unable to wage a winter campaign against the Soviet army given our current state of preparedness. As soon as the autumn winds began to blow, Imperial headquarters, in a move unusual for the normally face-obsessed Japanese army, washed its hand off the fighting and through diplomatic negotiations ceded the barren Hulunbuir steppe to outer Mongolian and Soviet troops. In a footnote, the author pointed out that Yoshitaka Wataya had been purged from holding public office by MacArthur's occupation after the war, and for a time had lived in seclusion in his native Niigata, but he had been persuaded by the Conservative Party to run for the office after the purge was lifted and served 2 terms in the upper house before changing to the lower house. A calligraphic scroll of kanji Ishiwara's hung on the wall of his office. I had no idea what kind of Diet member Noboru Wataya's uncle had been or what he had accomplished as a politician. He did serve as a cabinet minister once, and he seems to have been highly influential with the people of his district, but he never became a leader in national politics. Now his political constituency had been inherited by his nephew, Noboru Wataya. I put the book away and, folding my arms behind my head, stared out the window in the vague direction of the front gate. Soon the gate would open inward and the Mercedes-Benz would appear, with Cinnamon at the wheel. He would be bringing another client. These clients and I were joined by the mark on my cheek. Cinnamon's grandfather, Nordmac's father, and I were also joined by the mark on my cheek. Cinnamon's grandfather and Lieutenant Mamiya were joined by the city of Xinjiang. Lieutenant Mamiya and the clairvoyant Mr. Honda were joined by their special duties on the Manchurian-Mongolian border, and Kumiko and I had been introduced to Mr. Honda by Noboru Wataya's family. Lieutenant Mamiya and I were joined by our experiences in our respective wells, his in Mongolia, mine on the property where I was sitting now. Also on this property had once lived an army officer who had commanded troops in China. All of these were linked as in a circle, at the center of which stood pre-war Manchuria, continental East Asia, and the short war of 1939 in Nomonhan. But why Kumiko and I should have been drawn into this historical chain of cause and effect I could not comprehend. All of these events had occurred long before Kumiko and I were born. I sat at Cinnamon's desk and placed my hands on the keyboard. The feel of my fingers on the keys was still fresh from my conversation with Kumiko. That computer conversation had been monitored by Noboru Wataya. I was sure. He was trying to learn something from it. He certainly hadn't arranged for us to make contact that way out of the goodness of his heart. He and his men were almost certainly trying to use the access they had gained to Cinnamon's computer through the communications link in order to learn the secrets of this place. But I was not worried about that. The depths of this computer were the very depths of Cinnamon himself, and they had no way of knowing how incalculably deep that was.